So far, you've heard me talk about mitosis and asexual reproduction, which means making more of the same. Now we're going to talk about sexual reproduction. So sexual reproduction basically involves an organism switching between two states as far as the genetic composition is involved. So the organism switches between a haploid state and a diploid state, and this is a cycle that keeps going on. Part of an organism's life cycle happens in a haploid state and part of it in a diploid state. And different organisms spend a different amount of time on each stage. Some organisms are most of the time spent as a diploid, some organisms spend most of the time as a haploid. So let's look at a couple of them. Human beings are said to be diploid dominant. That means that the majority of their life cycle, they spend their life being diploid. And it starts with a fertilized egg that is a diploid. It's going to divide and develop, and it's going to lead to adult organisms. Then at some part of their life, the adult organisms produce haploid cells, which we know of them to be as sperm or egg. Now, this process of producing haploid cells is called meiosis. Now, these haploid forms of this type of organism, which is a human, they fuse and they form the diploid all over again, so this goes through the circle. So us human beings, we spend very little time in our life cycle as haploid, and we do not have multicellular haploid forms. The haploid form of a human being is all single cell form. This is unlike plants, which undergo what's called alternation of generation. That means they have both multicellular forms, and they spend about equal time in the haploid and a diploid state. So if we follow the same step as we did with human beings, a zygote is formed from fusion of two haploids, and then this zygote, through the process of mitosis and differentiation, gives rise to an adult plant. In this case, we're looking at a fern. We call this, in the plant nomenclature, we call this diploid multicellular organism, this plant called sporophyte. Why? Because it produces spores. So as a result of meiosis, it produces spores which are haploid. So you go from a diploid stage into a haploid stage. Now what happens in this plant is that these haploid cells, they start growing via mitosis, and they actually form a multicellular form of the plant called gametophyte. Now, this multicellular haploid form is going to undergo meiosis and produce egg and sperm, which then come together to form a diploid organism. So that's for plants. Now, when we talk about sexual reproduction, the process in which sperm and egg are formed is that part of the sexual reproduction we're going to mostly focus on. So we're going to take a look at what happens to a cell cytoplasm, and most importantly, we're going to talk about what happens to the chromosome. So that's why I have a slide here to kind of review a little bit of what we learned about chromosomes. Now, in a diploid stage, and if we use humans as an example, we know that a diploid organism has chromosomes in pairwise. So in the previously, when we talked about chromosomes, we said that one set of chromosomes for human beings is 23 chromosomes, and then we have 2 of each chromosome in a diploid. So you can see that here we have the pairwise chromosome 1, 2, 3, 4, so on and so forth, up to chromosome 22. We also have sex chromosomes, which determine the sex of the individual. Now these chromosomes, all of these chromosomes, like let me turn on my laser pointer, these chromosomes from 1 to 22, these are called autosomal chromosomes. That means they are non-sex chromosomes. And these two are called sex chromosomes. In females, we have two X chromosomes, which are about the same size. They're basically homologous to each other. In males, we have a big X and a small Y, and an X and Y are homologous in only parts of the chromosome, obviously, because Y is very little. Now remember that we call these chromosomes homologous chromosomes, these pairwise. So this chromosome is homologous to this one. One comes from the mother and one comes from the father. And we also mentioned that homologous chromosomes look identical under the microscope. But are they identical? No, they're not. They carry the same genes, but they may carry different versions of the genes. So let's, that was a summary. Okay, in the human life cycle, what would happen if gametes were produced by mitosis? Which means what would happen if our bodies did not undergo meiosis to produce sperm and egg? We would just, instead, we would just produce, the male would produce a diploid cell and a female would produce a diploid cell, and then they would fuse and form a zygote. What would be the consequence of that? So make sure you answer that question.